Hello, welcome all. I'm very excited to welcome you today to this Water Research Foundation webcast for Project 5207. My name is Lindsay Bloxam. I'm the Research Program Manager with this project. The project title that we will be hearing about today is Establishing a Framework for Integrating Stormwater Capture into Water Supply Planning. We have a wonderful set of speakers for you today who are all working very hard on this project, and we're excited to show you what we've learned so far. Before I hand it off and we get going, I will go through a few housekeeping items. You should see there on your screen a few bullets that we can follow along to help make this a smooth webcast for all. First and foremost, if you have any questions, we want to engage with you today, but you can submit those questions at any time throughout the presentation. There's a question box there where you can type it in. We will do 2 sessions of Q&A during the presentation. So there will be a break about partway through and then a break at the end where we can have some discussion and answer the questions that you've put in. So even though we won't answer them right away, hold tight, they will be answered later. And if there are any that we don't get to, we should be able to follow up after the webcast as well. You will be able to download the slides and a recording of this webcast on our website. The same links that you followed to register, you can find the recording there later. You can also download the slides now. You should see that on the screen and access a link to the project page under the event resources section there on the screen. So you can see that now. If you would like to have one, a certificate of completion will be automatically generated after the webcast and sent to you. If for some reason you have any questions regarding that, please contact Michelle. Her email is there on the screen, and you can contact myself as well, and we'll be sure to help you out. And then please do stay on to the end of the webcast where we will ask you to fill out a quick survey that helps us ensure that our webcasts are reaching folks and that everyone is getting the most out of them. So please help us out by completing the survey at the end. So typically on these webcasts, we start with kind of a long list of bios and intros, but we want to make sure we have time for all of the discussion that we want to have. So you can actually see there on your slide, if you go to the top on the screen and you click speaker bios there at any point during the webcast, you can learn about our speakers there. So as they come on, they will introduce themselves with their name and their title, and then you can find them there and learn more about their background and their expertise. So please use that. That's a great resource. Again, we have a fabulous set of speakers here today. Okay, so our agenda, I will in just a second be handing the presentation over to Shannon Spurlock with the Pacific Institute, PI on the project. And you can see there, she's going to go over the overview and approach and then hand it off for key components of the project to others participating in the work with her and supporting the work. And then, as I mentioned, we will have questions, kind of part 1, a bit more info, and then questions part 2. So that's all from me. Shannon, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lindsay. And welcome, everyone. We're so excited that you are joining us for this webcast today. One of the things I want to talk about with WER 5207 is that this is all about thinking about how stormwater can contribute to water supply planning and what are the tools needed to help agencies and utilities in that endeavor. And this is in the midst of what we see as very much a shifting paradigm. In the past and even currently in many areas, stormwater is seen as a nuisance, something that's detrimental and can often have grave consequences. We are also understanding more and more how stormwater can contribute to water resilience, contribute to our water supplies, and to thriving communities. And so with that, we are excited to think about the role our project team can play in supporting utilities and agencies by developing tools and practical resources for them to incorporate stormwater into their water supply planning. The project objectives of 5207 include evaluating and understanding the potential value and feasibility of tapping stormwater as a source of supply within the context of multi-benefit stormwater management. And also thinking about navigating the complex process of working with other utilities, regulators, elected officials, and relevant stakeholders to move these ideas into action. What are the tools and resources that are needed to support utilities in this view? Our project team, I'm always so honored and privileged to be working alongside this group, and our project team is comprised of, in alphabetical order, well, actually, it's not in alphabetical order. It used to be. Dr. Sybil Charbel out of Colorado State University. She's going to be talking about water quality and treatment technology. Dr. Bob Rauscher and Janet Clements. Dr. Bob Rauscher from Rauscher LLC and Janet Clements from One Water Econ are really taking on the economics analysis of this project. Stephen Groner from SGA Marketing is going to be talking about communications in the realm of the stormwater resource world. Dave Smith from Water Innovation Services is really leading the regulatory analysis of this project. Jane Clary is supporting with some of the technological information and background when we think about as it applies to water quality. Dr. Seth Brown from the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance is really leading the funding and financing portion of this project. And myself and Jess Derry are the primary staff from Pacific Institute, really looking at tying this all together, thinking about interagency collaboration, and also really leveraging our existing work on understanding the volumetric potential for stormwater capture across the United States and how this can advance the role of stormwater into water supply planning. So in 5207, I've referenced working with utility and agency partners to really think about practical tools to help them consider how stormwater can be incorporated into their water supply portfolios. We've taken our project partners and put them into three distinct buckets. The retrospective case study partners. These are agencies and utilities that have been doing this for a while. They're a little further along in how they've really weighed the lenses of economics, regulation, policy, funding, financing. And then there are those who are in the midst of their journey. And they're doing some really remarkable, noteworthy programs, and they're continuing to evolve and move ahead. Actually, all of these are continuing to evolve and grow, just different places in their journey. And then with the prospective case studies, these partners are thinking actively about what can stormwater look like in our water supply portfolio. What can it contribute? And beginning to explore that. And they may have different drivers for each of them, different lenses that they might have funding and financing sorted out, but not as much regulatory. And so they are also at different places in their journey. With these case study partners, our team is building a framework and tools based on the known experiences of retrospective case study partners and our hybrid case study partners, and creating tools that we will ground truth with our prospective case study partners. It's important to each and every team member to know that the tools and resources that are being developed are practical and relevant to a variety of geographic locations and contexts. So just to kind of re-summarize quickly that the research approach that we are taking uses several different lenses, everything from economics to looking at regulatory issues to understanding the national potential of where we're even starting from. Is this doable volumetrically, to thinking about water quality concerns. And so this is a multifaceted approach meant to be tailored to different agencies and utilities so that they can adopt stormwater into their existing water supply portfolio and be overall a more water resilient entity. So I'm going to introduce really quickly the idea and the research around the volumetric potential for capturing stormwater in the United States. So in early 2024, the Pacific Institute team, led by Dr. Brooke Berhanu, looked at research and analysis in partnership with Second Nature, which is our technology-based partner in this realm, to understand what is the opportunity for estimating urban stormwater runoff across the United States. We looked at just right around 2,700 different urban areas and came up that with just under 60 million acre feet, or 59.5 million acre feet, that is the annual opportunity for stormwater runoff across the United States. And note, in a very noteworthy way, this represents about 93% of industrial and municipal water use. So these numbers are striking and very large. And it's worth noting that these numbers, I'll talk about this in a couple more slides, come from areas that are known to be water rich as well as water scarce. It is worth noting that coastal areas offer an outsized opportunity. And while they just account for 12% of the urban land area, they actually account for 37% of that urban stormwater runoff. And so stormwater capture is largely an untapped, unrealized resource that can benefit water resilience planning across the United States, and when possible and when practical, contribute to the water supply planning. And so here is what that number, the spread of opportunity looks like from across the United States. The Pacific Institute is not the first organization to look at what this potential is. It is worth noting that an earlier study in which actually Dr. Seth Brown, one of my colleagues who you'll hear from later, the numbers that they came up with in 2020 are fairly complementary in this space. And then there's even an earlier estimate from the early 2000s from the EPA. And while we weren't able to find the methodology behind the EPA numbers, it is one of the presumptions is that growth in number is due to an increase of urbanization across the United States as one of the contributing factors. So when we talk about there being an outsized opportunity in coastal areas, it's worth noting that many of the coastal areas in the Great Lakes region, Atlantic coastline, and Pacific coastline are not constrained by many of the similar same water rights concerns that might be constraining more upstream water users or inland. And so this is one of the reasons why some of the coastal areas have some of the greatest opportunity for stormwater capture and contributing towards those supplies. Again, just looking at the disproportionate impact that 12% of land area can have by contributing towards 37% of that national runoff potential. And then when we look across the country, again, I earlier referenced the difference between the water-rich and water-scarce areas and the extent to which they contribute to this number. So of the 2,700 areas, there are 20 listed here in the top 20, and we'll see that LA comes in at number 18. And so even if we think about all the significant atmospheric rivers, there is great opportunity for stormwater to be included in water supply planning and increased resilience in these areas. One thing when we think about a national potential, these are big numbers. And actually, I'm going to clarify a couple things here. Just under 60 million acre feet per year is that total number. It does not take into consideration the existing stormwater capture that is occurring. And I want to be very clear that all that cannot be captured, and nor should it be captured. But that is the total opportunity. For the amount that can be captured and makes sense to be captured, there are some recommendations that the Pacific Institute, in partnership with an advisory group, came up with to unlock that potential. And they've been bucketed in everything from regulatory guidance to funding and financing to institutional governance and research and technical. We're going to hear some of these things tapped into today, but it's worth noting that if any utility, agency, municipality is looking to unlock the potential for stormwater to contribute to local water supply planning, then they might need to pursue regulatory changes, increased funding and financing opportunities, and so on. So with that overview, I'm going to hand it off to my esteemed colleague, Dave Smith, and he's going to take us into the next portion of this webcast. Take it away, Dave.
Hi, folks. I'm Dave Smith, and I'm with Water Innovation Services, a small consulting firm. And I'm happy to be with you to talk a little bit about what we're learning about how regulation affects people's interest in pursuing stormwater and rainwater capture and use across the U.S. We are finding a great deal of interest among communities in exploring the option of stormwater capture and use across the whole nation, not just in the drier parts of the country, as Shannon suggested. What we're seeing in many places is that water quality regulatory requirements are a significant driver of interest in stormwater capture and use. For example, water quality discharge requirements associated with total maximum daily load requirements are a big driver of stormwater capture and use project development in Southern California. Rainwater capture and use seems to be driven more by local concerns and often ESG type concerns in the private sector and at the local level. So regulation can be a driver and a motivator for stormwater capture and use. We're also seeing that it can be a challenge, and I want to review some of our findings about why that might be the case. First of all, many project proponents are just confused about whether and how their projects are going to be regulated. And there's a couple of reasons for that confusion. First, there are several different types of regulation that affect stormwater capture and use. There's water quality related protection requirements like NPDES permits under the Clean Water Act, water quality certifications under Section 401, and in many cases, state and local requirements intended to protect human health or environmental health. But we also have water reuse restrictions. Shannon alluded to water rights. It's a big issue in many Western states where the ability to keep stormwater or rainwater and put it to productive use might be limited by water rights. But we also see other restrictions under local plumbing codes, zoning codes, health department rules, and things like that on the mechanics about how water can be captured and used. On top of that, any project of any size often encounters facility siting requirements, land use requirements, environmental impact regulations, endangered species reviews, things like that. And so it can often be very daunting for project proponents to figure out which types of regulation might apply to a project they're pursuing. On top of that, very few states have clear regulatory pathways in place right now that show how they will regulate stormwater capture and use. And in many cases, they're kind of making it up on a project-by-project basis or as they go along. A few states have considered developing guidance or regulations for stormwater capture and use. As we're seeing from current experience in the state of Minnesota, this can be quite contentious. And a process is still underway in Minnesota to find the right balance between setting protective rules and those which proponents find to be realistic to implement. So in the absence of strong or specific state regulatory frameworks, it can be a little bit difficult to figure out how individual projects are going to be regulated. In general, I would say we're further along in most of the country in setting clearer rules around how rainwater harvesting is going to happen at a building scale or a smaller scale. And a lot of that is thanks to the great work by the National Blue Ribbon Commission on Non-Potable Reuse to identify treatment needs and associate regulatory frameworks for figuring out how to do in-building rainwater capture and use in safe ways. Should also be worth noting that permits can be an incentive toward moving toward reuse. For example, we're seeing some permits, some municipal stormwater permits in Southern California incorporate specific provisions that provide greater flexibility or greater time to pursue implementation through projects that incorporate capture and use and other kinds of goals, in addition to treating or managing stormwater to address water quality concerns. So stormwater can have a lot of different impacts on interests in pursuing capture and use. As part of this project, we're trying to prepare a framework to provide a bit of guidance to users that reflects some of this complexity in the regulatory world. And this diagram simply summarizes what we are going to recommend that a lot of people use to pursue this. And it really is recognizing that it's important to recognize early what kinds of regulatory mechanisms might affect a project that you're interested in implementing. And for proponents to engage with regulatory agencies very early in the design process to develop a sense of mutual understanding about how a project will be implemented and what's the appropriate sequence through which to go through different regulatory processes. And we think that by following this kind of framework of iterative regulatory engagement, it's going to reduce the likelihood of misunderstandings and surprises later in project development. It's also worth emphasizing that the regulatory process does not end when a permit is issued. There's often follow-up and compliance, reporting, inspections, and things like that happen. So it's important to think about regulatory processes as a whole cycle that in some cases goes on and on into the future. We're also developing some tools for this project that will help people ask questions of themselves to identify which specific types of regulatory mechanisms will apply to them. And I apologize for this kind of daunting looking table, but it's intended to provide a question-based approach to figuring out who's going to want to regulate me if I'm doing different kinds of projects. And it reflects that there are those different types of regulatory mechanisms that may apply. Now, along the way, we also expect that we're going to try to build on the experiences of the communities we are working with and make some additional suggestions in terms of new research and regulatory development work that might be warranted to clarify how regulation is going to affect stormwater and rainwater capture and use. And figuring out how this is going to be regulated is closely associated with what levels of treatment we expect for different end uses of stormwater or rainwater that are captured. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to talk about those issues to Dr. Sybil Charvel.
Well, thank you, Dave, very much. And thanks everyone for attending today. I'm Sybil Charvel at Colorado State University as part of the One Water Solutions Institute. And like Dave said, we're going to transition now into treatment requirements for stormwater capture and use and some of the technologies that can be used for treatment. As we heard from Dave, the water quality and treatment requirements are really lacking in a lot of regulations. There are some locales that have taken this on a little bit more aggressively and have developed treatment requirements or potentially even log reduction requirements or specified treatment technologies or water quality requirements, but those are few and there's a lot of variability nationally in what that looks like. Dave also mentioned the National Blue Ribbon Commission, which I'm going to provide a little bit of background there because some of the first recommendations came through the National Blue Ribbon Commission and a 2017 it was actually then WERF guidance that was informing the National Blue Ribbon Commission guidance for on-site non-potable water systems. This document that includes these guidance does include both stormwater and roof runoff or rainwater. And it has been applied for regulatory frameworks in several locations. mostly cities and perhaps some states for regulation of stormwater and for regulation of treatment requirements with respect to developing fit-for-purpose treatment systems for stormwater treatment. Like Dave mentioned, there's debate in the practicing world with respect to some of the recommendations that came out of this work and how pragmatic they may be to implement. So the effort was really based on these risk-based approaches and using quantitative microbial risk assessment to determine the level of treatment of pathogens required for safe use of stormwater for high contact uses. Again, we did hear from Minnesota that there's some debate around with the health department and the recommendations that they're putting forward, from which the basis is this work put forward from the National Blue Ribbon Commission, and practitioners who are finding those requirements to be highly stringent and sometimes not practical. So there was another Water Research Foundation project, 5034, that was completed in 2023, so last year, that takes the guidance that was from the 2017 document, takes it a little bit further. It included a review of a larger national data set on stormwater quality, and it also made an attempt to really be specific about stormwater microbial risks and the level of treatment needed, and provide some specific guidance there. There were some vague pieces in the 2017 guidance that came out as well. So this kind of takes us through the different guidance and regulatory documents that have been created to help inform regulations in this area. The WRF 5034 document does really require kind of a high level of background to make decisions. And in order to kind of decipher that out, we're working in this current framework to simplify some pieces of that, providing options for selection of treatment requirements, and then examples of treatment trains and monitoring and control technologies to meet water quality and hydrologic targets, including real-time control. So the purpose of inclusion of this within this framework is to, again, kind of whittle down what's in the 5034 project into some really clear decision-making processes, and also to explain further the rationale for the treatment requirements that are laid out. So kind of getting into some of the tools and guidance that we're putting forward in this particular framework. There's a couple steps that we outline for development of stormwater treatment requirements. And the first of those is assessment of a need for stormwater treatment requirements. There are many cases where there's not a risk of human exposure to treated stormwater. So maybe that is related to time of irrigation, or maybe use of drip irrigation systems where people do not come into direct contact with that water. It's important to note that all of the pathogen reduction requirements that came out of the previous work included assumptions of human inhalation or contact with the stormwater as it's being used for irrigation. So when there's not human contact, there's not a need for treatment. So that's the first piece, is kind of providing some additional explanation on what are those cases that we may not have to think about these extensive treatment requirements. And then the next step, second bullet there, determine treatment level required. This is based on a selected risk threshold, or risk tolerance. So how much risk is the health department willing to accept and the public willing to accept? And then an approach for treatment level, and then selecting an approach for deciding on the treatment train, and then developing requirements. Okay, so this is one of the pieces that was in the WRF 5034, and this slide is kind of packed, and I'm not going to go through all of this today, but I think this serves as a nice example of sort of the way that we're laying out these options that were laid out in 5034, but in a way that can help inform decisions on how to go. So there were two options that were laid out. One was conservative treatment, and the option two is low treatment category. The low treatment category gets designers into a place where they can design systems that are a lot more pragmatic, probably more consistent with what we see happening in practice currently. But if there's these high exposure end uses, it does require that there's some extensive monitoring. So this kind of outlines what are the benefits of these two different options, what are considerations, and when to select each of the approaches. So for example, with the low treatment category that requires the more extensive monitoring, it requires that there's trained staff that are available to review the projects for approval and conduct compliance monitoring and make sure that projects are staying in compliance. And then conservative treatment kind of takes a lot of that burden away from maybe a regulatory body, but then puts more burden on the treatment requirements that are laid out in a system. So that's all kind of laid out within these various bullet points within this diagram. This lays out some example treatment trains. These were also provided in WRF 5034. These, I think, are really nice. So the basis for all of these is microfiltration followed by some disinfection, which usually includes ultraviolet and sometimes an additional chemical disinfection step, depending on either the risk level that can be tolerated, or if we can get into that low treatment category where less treatment is required, but more monitoring may be required in places where stormwater may be not as contaminated with human infectious pathogens. So this starts with the most stringent treatment at the top and goes to the more probably lower cost, more practical for implementation treatment at the bottom in part C there. And I think what's nice about these is it lays out the opportunity for folks to provide this kind of prescriptive approach where you could select from technologies that are validated for pathogen reduction, for microfiltration, for example, and ultraviolet systems, and then chlorine doses and things that are well accepted, and simply provide lists of unit treatment processes and even specific technology providers that have been validated to meet the requirements, so that the designers and implementers of projects can simply select from kind of these lists of pre-approved systems. So that's one approach. And then one could also take a more custom design approach and allow for flexibility and selection of unit treatment processes. This is nice because it allows for that flexibility and more room for innovation and things of that sort, but then requires some validation and, again, a little bit more oversight from health departments. So those considerations are also laid out in a similar set of figures that we just looked at, that kind of says, okay, prescriptive versus these custom designs, and what you may want to consider is benefits considerations and when to select that approach. For example, the option 2, when to select that approach is when flexibility in design is a priority and that trained staff are available that can spend time reviewing and approving the proposed designs that are put forward by practitioners. So the intent here, again, is really to lay out some of these different considerations and benefits and options that are available for thinking through the treatment requirement process, and to really provide some pragmatic and simpler to follow guidance in this area. So from here, we are going to move into our first phase. Again, in case people weren't here for the beginning, we are separating this webinar into kind of 2 phases where we've covered some of the material, and then we're going to do a question and answer period and then get back to the rest of the presentation and take a second set of questions later at the end.
Okay, thank you. With that, as Sybil mentioned, we're going to dive on into our first Q&A session. We do have several questions in the chat, so we're going to start getting to those. And I have my timekeeper. Thank you. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes for this first Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and dive us on in. Let me get them up so that I can read them. We don't miss anything. Okay, so our first question. Water quality remains a significant challenge for stormwater capture and reuse, especially concerning bacterial contamination and the use of log reduction targets for non-potable purposes, such as irrigation in restricted and non-restricted scenarios. Given that health departments and communities are often hesitant due to the high cost of treatment, systems required to meet regulations, even when the water is not intended for drinking, how would you address this challenge to encourage broader acceptance of stormwater reuse? What strategies or technologies do you believe could bridge the gap between regulatory demands and practical, cost-effective implementation for community use? I think, Sybil, we can pass that question on to you.
Yeah, thank you. This is a great question. I think we kind of alluded to this throughout the presentation, where there's a bit of a conflict between meeting some of these health-based targets that have been put forward for pathogen reduction and having systems that are cost-effective to implement. And the reality of what national data show is that stormwater is highly variable in contamination with microbial contaminants, and it's difficult to predict when and where those contaminants will be present. So there's really, for me, there's a couple of options to still try to keep systems more simple. And there was a piece in the question regarding restricted versus unrestricted irrigation practices. And I think one approach is to identify approaches where you can, to keep a treatment level less stringent, is to really think about how to make less humans be exposed to the irrigation water. And that can include things like time of irrigation. Now, with your irrigating sports fields and things like that, where there's a lot of human contact in the day, those are maybe not good options to consider, but maybe considering irrigating in areas that don't have a lot of human contact and where you can close the area or make it unrestricted or no trespassing during irrigation events. Those are ways to really simplify the treatment requirements for stormwater. The other approach is around the monitoring and getting into that low treatment category. And I'm not going to argue that that's not burdensome, because the monitoring requirements to do that are extensive. And as those in the stormwater field know, monitoring stormwater is complex. We can't just monitor one event. We need to monitor multiple events, get an event mean concentration, and really confirm that we don't have presence of human fecal material and human infectious pathogens in that water. And that's somewhat of a burdensome process, but can get people into that lower treatment requirements category. So I think, to answer the question, if you want to keep the system simple, is to avoid scenarios with high human exposures.
Thank you. Okay, on to our next question. Curious if your research on potential for replacing potable water with stormwater reuse included an analysis of the timing on when stormwater could be collected versus when the water is needed. For example, in a Western state with dry summers and wet winters, stormwater would need to be collected and stored for a long time if its use was going to replace our peak need in the summer. Dave, I think we can pass that one on to you.
You know, I'd start with the overarching observation that stormwater is more complicated than wastewater when we're thinking about recycling, and the episodic nature of stormwater events and the often sort of the off timing between when we have a lot of stormwater and when we have a lot of demand for recycled water are really significant issues in looking at the viability of stormwater as to augment water supply and offset demand on potable water. So we are certainly considering this. I mean, I think part of this is in looking at sort of the economics of stormwater capture and use. It means explicitly considering options for storage. in most of the country, there's a lot of interest in aquifer storage and in pursuing aquifer recharge with captured stormwater as a way to top up aquifers and have that water available at the time when demand for water is higher. And that's one way to address this. In other cases, people are looking at the use of surface ponds and things like that as storage options. But in highly developed urban areas, storage is often very complicated or expensive to develop. So I guess we would say it's clearly a factor in looking at the viability of stormwater capture and use that we will identify here. But it may be something that Janet wants to talk about a little bit when we're talking about how we're evaluating the economics of capture and use.
And I'll add one point to that. When we talked about the coastal opportunities, something Dave brings up into that question, I believe the question came from someone out of Seattle. We wouldn't be able to hold on to stormwater due to water rights. In Colorado, we have a limited detainment time before that would have to flow on to the downstream users who have rights to that water. And I'm going to say 72 hours is our max detainment time. So anyway, just pointing out that coastal opportunities again, may offer some greater opportunities than inland upstream users. So.
Thank you. Okay, we have a few more minutes here. Can you provide an example of making the choice between conservative and low treatment decisions? I think, Sybil, that would be you.
Yeah, so and I didn't get very much into detail with this, but the basis for that really comes around to identifying low treatment category projects as ones where there is a lower presence of human fecal material. So we use what's called human microbial source trackers to identify when there's contamination of stormwater with human fecal matter. That contamination often comes from sewer collection, wastewater collection systems and wastewater sewers. And when those are perhaps leaking, and then pathogens and fecal material end up in soils and ultimately end up in stormwater. It's very difficult. We never were able to find, we did lots of analysis to try to figure out, okay, how can we predict this? Age of infrastructure, all of these kinds of things. It's really difficult to predict when stormwater may be highly contaminated. You would understand in an area that maybe there's a homeless encampment in an urban area, that would be a highly contaminated potential source. But outside of that, it's very difficult to predict. And therefore, you really kind of have to monitor for these microbial source trackers. Those are readily measured in many labs across the United States. And so those, we provide exact, kind of numerical cutoff values in our guidance about when one would need to go into that. So really, to get into that low treatment category, we've really recommended some monitoring of the stormwater to see if there's these human microbial source trackers that would indicate a level of fecal contamination that would put you into needing to go into the conservative treatment or be able to allow for the more simple treatment category.
If I may, I wanted to kind of build on Sybil's answer. I've noted a couple of the questions are focusing on non-pathogen pollutants. And while we're talking a lot about pathogen control as a critical issue in stormwater capture and use, we do recognize that there's a lot of pollutants out there in stormwater and sometimes in rainwater, and that sometimes those need to be controlled to protect human health or environmental health. And so what we are seeing is probably there's been less work done to articulate the specific treatment requirements around stormwater capture for specific uses for non-pathogen contaminants. We can build a lot on the work that has been done that looks at the efficacy of different stormwater control management practices and treatment systems to tackle different kinds of pollutants. And there's a lot of work out there looking at metals, nutrients, things like that, that we're trying to draw upon and identifying control needs for these non-pathogen pollutants. As in the rest of the world, there's some big challenges for some of these emerging contaminants like PFAS, 6-PPD, and others that we don't think that the field has gotten it figured out yet. And so what we're trying to do is sort of identify what people have been doing to try to tackle those additional pollutants as they're developing control schemes and regulatory frameworks, but also identify the areas where there seems to be critical need for additional research and kind of development to support kind of rounding out the focus to look at the full suite of pollutants that might be of concern.
Thank you. That's helpful. I think that addresses several of the questions that I see here in the chat. A lot of focus, like you said, on different contaminants. Kind of a follow-up to that, too. One question asked if the water will be stored after treatment. Is pathogen regrowth a concern, and how would one handle this? I don't know, Dave.
Yes, it is a concern. Sybil, do you want to? I mean, yes, it is a concern, and we would apply a lot of the same thinking that's already done when you look at management of water, which you keep around after you do additional disinfection before you distribute it to its ultimate use.
Yeah, most of the time, there's not a lot of storage after use. You kind of would probably treat the water more on demand basis, but those that where there is storage, there would be need for residual chlorine and things of that sort to prevent regrowth.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions in here, so I'm trying to look through and see some. Shannon, if you want to chime in, if there are any that.
Well, actually, yeah, I think for some people, the role of the Blue Ribbon Commission might be interesting. They typically think about this more as maybe on-site reuse and the way reuse is traditionally defined. And I'm wondering, actually, Sybil or Dave, if you can speak to the role of the Blue Ribbon Commission and how it influences this area.
I guess I would say, and Sybil, please chime in, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. And the National Blue Ribbon Commission has done excellent work to kind of frame the issues and develop the scientific basis for addressing particularly pathogen contamination that you would see associated with on-site non-potable reuse. So I think, and we've been in touch with the leadership of the commission and reviewed many of their products. Sybil's been involved in a lot of that work directly through her work, prior work. I think we're trying to complement that and to try to talk a little bit about what are some of the challenges associated with potential potable use of captured stormwater. To also look at non-pathogen contaminants, which have been maybe a lesser focus of the National Blue Ribbon Commission. But we're trying to make this effort kind of build upon and complement their work.
That was great, Dave. I have nothing to add, actually.
Great. I guess in the final minutes here, I'll pull one thing out, just based on one of the recommendations that came out of PI's national assessment, and Dave and Sybil can speak to this too, but the question of, is there a list anywhere of communities and the range of stormwater uses that have been adopted from kind of direct potable reuse on down? And I'll say that one of the recommendations to unlock this potential to incorporate stormwater into water supply planning and is to increase the allowed end uses. Currently, there are predominantly non-potable outdoor uses allowed, and there's much greater opportunity, especially with the right treatment, to allow for indoor uses. And so that is one of the recommendations to come out of that. I do know there are some there are some places where stormwater is being treated and used for toilet flushing, for example. In Minnesota, it's being used for food production in urban settings and urban gardens. Sybil and Dave, did you want to add on to that as well as around those allowed end uses and expanding those?
Yeah, I can add a little bit, which I think our WRF 5034 project is a really good resource for that information, not just from the perspective of allowed uses, but actually goes through example projects with all of those different end uses. I think even one with the potable end use, but I don't remember, although that's very uncommon. I feel like there was at least one that touched on that, but several indoor uses that are highlighted as an examples in those projects, as well as mostly, of course, the outdoor irrigation projects. But that report does include kind of a summary of the projects that have been done today and the types of treatment systems that are in place in those projects. So I think that is a really good resource for that information.
I just wanted to add one point that I think sort of relates to this, and it relates to a question that Jim Rasmus asked as well. I mentioned before that stormwater capture and use can be very complicated, and it's because you've got such diversity in the qualities and the sources of stormwater around the country, but also a lot of different pathways through which stormwater and rainwater can be captured and put to use. Sometimes it's immediate, sometimes it's stored first, sometimes it's for potable, sometimes it's for different non-potable sources. And because those pathways are complicated, we are trying to create kind of a typology of the different pathways and destinations of different types of stormwater capture and use, and then recognize that there's going to be different economic arguments or different economic models for each of those different pathways, different regulatory and treatment concerns and options, and to try to represent as faithfully as we can what are the different ways in which stormwater capture and use of different types present as options around the country, and what kind of challenges are associated with those. And we're going to try to build on some prior work to create typologies about stormwater capture and use, including a great project that Jim worked on.
Okay, so I think that takes us to the end of our Q&A session, session 1. We'll continue on with the presentation. Thank you, Sybil and Dave and Shannon.
All right, can everyone hear me? I am Jana Clements, and I am part of the project team that is working on providing information about the economics of stormwater capture and use. So as I'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide, stormwater capture and use can obviously provide significant benefits for both water supply utilities, stormwater management agencies, and the broader communities that they serve. But as many of you out there are familiar with, there are often significant economic challenges associated with implementing stormwater capture and use, particularly from a water supply perspective. Often we think about what the expense will be. It's expensive to do this. How are we going to implement cost recovery, and how are we going to finance it? Seth will talk a little bit more about that. And then from a water supply perspective, we often think, a key question is, well, it's a stormwater problem, right? Are they should pay to implement projects that capture stormwater use. And alternatively, from a stormwater utility perspective, they're probably thinking the same thing, right? It's a water supply project. Why should we pay for it? And I think what's really key to answering a lot of those challenges is to think about it from a larger kind of business case or economic perspective. So it's important to be able to forge a strong business case in order to overcome some of those challenges. And there's really several kind of key aspects of that. The first is, we have to really fully understand the multiple benefits that these projects can provide. So we want to be able to identify, quantify, and monetize when we can the kind of full range of applicable benefits. We also want to put the costs of these different projects into kind of a suitable context. So we don't want to think about it, and I'll talk a little bit more on the next couple slides here. We don't necessarily want to think about it from oh, I'm a stormwater agency, and if I implement this, it's going to be a little more expensive than, doing this over here to capture stormwater. And likewise from a water supply perspective. When we think of the overall cost together, that's really what we need to compare it to. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And this information, I think what's really important about this, can really help us to understand and develop what we often call a beneficiaries pay approach. And this is really developing kind of a framework for allocating and recovering costs based on the benefits that the projects provide. So, there are multiple benefits associated with these projects. And when we think about the kind of economic perspective, rather than just the kind of financial perspective, we want to fully, identify the range of benefits that are applicable. So we want to start with, okay, here's the benefits to water supply utilities. Stormwater capture and use can provide, it can provide direct supply augmentation. So when you add water, when water utility adds supply directly to their water supply portfolio by managing stormwater capture inflows or capturing, and managing that water to inflow into surface reservoirs and or recharging aquifers. That's kind of direct supply augmentation. That obviously has a lot of benefits in terms of increasing water supply reliability and resilience. It can reduce the risk of shortages, particularly in drought-prone areas. Obviously, that can be a significant benefit. There's also kind of what we call indirect supply augmentation. So this is when we're offsetting potable reuse by capturing stormwater in a more decentralized way and using it to for irrigation purposes, for example, offsetting water supplies that would normally have to be demanded from a centralized water facility and pumped and treated and distributed to customers. There are a couple of different co-benefits too that we can think about that apply kind of in a water supply context. So stormwater capture projects, projects that manage stormwater through infiltration or treatment, can also protect source water, right? It can reduce point or non-point source loading into local waterways and other kind of water supplies. That saves water utilities and water suppliers, or can save them a significant amount of money. There's also, when you're managing stormwater flows for the purposes of, flood risk reduction, that can result in significant kind of infrastructure protection benefits, again, resulting in avoided costs for water suppliers. When we want to think, again, we're talking about kind of what we have on the title of this slide here is the 2-for-1 nature of stormwater capture and use. Obviously, when you're managing stormwater, capturing it, that provides significant benefits to stormwater utilities or folks charged with managing stormwater. And obviously, that's kind of their primary objective, right? So again, we're improving water quality. That not only can protect source waters, but is the primary objective of stormwater managers, whether it's just providing, that benefit to their community or meeting permit requirements. And again, stormwater capture that is intended for the purposes of flood risk reduction obviously has significant benefits, not only to protect infrastructure, but avoid damages to buildings, protect people, and protect public health. When we think about, what does all this mean and how do we bring this all together? One of the key challenges that I mentioned early on was, there's often difficulties in determining who pays. So we talked about the multiple benefits. This is just a relatively simple example or simple slide that I went through last time, just talking about the benefits to water suppliers and the benefits to stormwater managers. There's often a greater set of community benefits that can also accrue, especially when we're talking about managing stormwater and capturing it through the use of natural infrastructure that can provide kind of greater community benefits. But in this example, if we're just thinking about two different agencies, right, we kind of meet that first step that we see, like who are the beneficiaries, who's benefiting, and how much are those benefits kind of worth? Rather than thinking about it from a financial perspective from each kind of siloed utility, a stormwater manager could say, well, we could do this, stormwater capture and use project, or we could manage stormwater in a different way, and it's a lot cheaper for us. But I think it's important to recognize, or from an economic perspective, and the business case can help inform the fact that, we need to look at the cost overall, right? Because we're often serving stormwater managers, water suppliers are often, serving the same group of people. And when we think about, and that's kind of the icon there that says different pocket, same pair of pants. When we think about joining together to implement, multi-benefit projects, it may be more expensive overall, or a little bit more expensive for each utility, but overall it's cheaper. And it does result in benefits for ratepayers. So how does this work in practice? What I have up here is a screenshot of a tool that my colleagues and I developed and will serve as an example as part of this research, looking at how benefits and building the business case can really inform cost share models. And again, that kind of beneficiaries pay approach. Now, this is a big spreadsheet, but I'll kind of lead you through it in different quadrants. This particular tool was developed for the Metropolitan Water District. It was developed for their use to think about how they might benefit and share costs associated with projects that capture stormwater, transform landscapes, including implementing cisterns or providing rebates for cisterns on private properties that can be used to irrigate landscapes and offset potable water use. If you start if you look at the green cells on this spreadsheet, that's where the inputs that you can input information to change, in this case, Metropolitan Water District, which is located in Southern California, for those that don't know. But this is where you could input in these green cells, where you can put inputs to look at what the different costs and benefits of this type of program would be. So in this case, we start in the left-hand upper quadrant. We say, okay, what if Metropolitan Water District said that they would invest $5 million in funding into these types of improvements? Now, if you go down to the bottom left, you can see the types of improvements that they're thinking about implementing, or that this tool could help them to make decisions about. So we have, in this particular example, we have, okay, we're gonna do landscape transformation, which includes stormwater capture on single family properties. We're gonna spend about 60% of our investment on that, 7% on larger cisterns, 3% on very large cisterns that result in fire risk reduction or store water for fire safety purposes. And then we're going to spend about 10% on landscape transformation and bioretention on commercial properties. So that's kind of the breakout of how these different, how the investment could break out across property types and different BMPs. Now, if you go back up to the upper left-hand side, that's where you can enter the kind of cost share for different agencies. In this case, we developed this tool for use by the Metropolitan Water District, but also thinking about, they have many retail agencies or retail water suppliers, and the main stormwater agency there in LA County is the county itself. So we're thinking, if we really have an understanding of benefits, which is actually shown on the right-hand side, the upper right, that's a breakdown of the multiple benefits associated with the different projects that I went over earlier. So in this case, and this is just a hypothetical example, in this case, we show in the dark blue, about 41% of the benefits of these projects would be related to water supply. Another 22% would be related to, 25% would be related to stormwater capture. And then the rest kind of makeup of benefits are related to different kind of community benefits. So if we start by saying, you know what, MWD is willing to invest $5 million because the water supply benefits are about 40%. They can share some of that with their retail water agencies, but they're also willing to pick up some of the community benefits. So we said, okay, what if MWD contributes 40%, right? Kind of paying their share of the benefits. That goes down and says, well, what if, the stormwater agency, they're getting about 25% of the benefits, plus they're also willing to pick up some of those community benefits as well. So we put them in at 30%, and it kind of goes down on different contribution amounts. And what that does is kind of allows for a cost share allocation based on benefits. And the last thing I'll show you is, if you go over here to the bottom right-hand corner, what this shows is that per acre foot of water conserved for MWD, this would amount, it would cost, the total project will cost about $4,200 per acre foot over a 30-year time frame. That's a little more than MWD is typically willing to pay for water supply. It's about $3,000 per acre foot. But when you break it up and they only have to pay 40% of that total cost, they then are only paying about 1,700 acre feet or $1,700 per acre foot. And that's kind of a, in this hypothetical example, a screaming deal for them. Now on the county side, who typically pays for stormwater, this tool is set up for the water supplier. But if they were to pay 30% of that 4,200, they'd also be paying less than they normally would. So at face value, it looks more expensive, but when you start to allocate costs based on benefits, it is better for each agency and it is better for the ratepayers. So that's a quick example. I'm going to pass it over to Seth, who's going to move us from economics to finance.
All right. Thanks, Janet. As far as our findings are concerned when it comes to funding and finance and alternative project delivery, the first finding, which is not going to surprise anybody, is that it's really difficult to find dollars and funding overall for stormwater. And then if you try to find funding for capture and use projects, it's even more challenging. So that's not going to surprise anyone, but that's something that we definitely have to state here. In addition, one of the funds, the federal funds at least, that provides a significant amount to the Clean Water Sector SRF program, the State Revolving Fund. It's not being used significantly by the stormwater sector writ large, and even used less for capture and use projects. Also, the funding that is available, again, a lot of the grant funding that's available especially is focused on capital investment and much less on for planning and O&M. So we need holistic funding, and that's not available in most instances. And lastly, local revenues are really the driver for stormwater, like many other infrastructure and utilities, but only maybe 25 to 30% of regulated stormwater communities have any type of dedicated funding source at the local level. And that, going to the next bullet on financing, this lack of dedicated local funds and funding sources and revenues limits financing options and capacity. It's like trying to go purchase a house and get a mortgage without having a job. You need to have that revenue coming in order to have that loan repayment. And that's just that's a limiting thing for communities writ large in stormwater. In terms of tying this together in the stormwater capture and use area, what we have, in the case study discussions we've had thus far, and we hear that the capture and use projects themselves don't pencil out. Maybe if they're part of some other project, maybe part of some other context, they can be, but oftentimes by themselves, they don't pencil out, especially in large urban areas. Think about the opportunity costs. Obviously, real estate is it's so valuable, especially in ultra urban areas, that the opportunity costs are significant. So you have to have significant benefits monetarily and otherwise. And we just don't see those and those benefits in that context oftentimes. And the risks and the costs associated with changing codes or dealing with codes and the complexities of that, as well as just risks with public health, as we've discussed thus far, are another challenge. But there are, like New York City we talked to, and I know there's some folks from New York City on here. There's a higher priority looking at water efficiency or CSOs, that type of thing, because I think there's just a lot more of a need there in front of them. But in Washington, D.C., they have set up a training program for stormwater, which helps to overcome some of these challenges and makes those connections that way, as well as just clear issues to overcome or ways to overcome the risks associated with public health exposure. Tying into what Janet was talking about with the benefits and co-benefits, source water protection clearly is going on, but to tie that in financially with stormwater is challenging to make that one for one. But there is an upstream downstream dynamic, which is complicated as well. And on the direct water supply for potable, obviously, because of all that we've talked about with the challenges of public health issues related to stormwater and the spikes related to certain types of pollutants, that's challenging. But I will say the indirect water supply augmentation of non-potable uses, which again Janet talked about, that's something that we're seeing a lot more of an ability to move forward, or a pragmatic approach to use that approach to offset using stormwater that's captured to offset potable use through using that runoff in non-potable uses. That gains added capacity for instance, for storage in runoff detention facilities, as well as additional quantity treatment that could be banked in certain issues, or banked or traded for water quality. And also there's a driver to, when you have retention standards, this is another opportunity or another option to drive interest in capturing and using runoff and stormwater. As far as the tools that we're developing right now, we've got, there's a lot of information out there on funding sources that are promising. A lot of this comes from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA funding that's out there. Hopefully, we don't know what the future of that's going to be, but there's a lot of money that's sloshing around. That there's ways to get to that, and that requires advice and navigating not just ways to get to that state revolving fund, which again is not being used as well as it could be for stormwater. But there's ways to get to both SRF as well as funding from FEMA or the Corps of Engineers, or the Overflow and Stormwater Reuse Grants Program is an example that's not highly capitalized at this point, but it will be in the future. So this is planning for tomorrow, really. And EPA has a new water TA program, Water Technical Assistance Program. The stormwater side of that is less developed, but it's becoming developed, and that's there's a lot of information out there, but it's just a lot to go through. So we're providing information about how do you navigate that world, and to try to get to the funding that is available today and tomorrow, we hope. And of course, the local funding and revenues is a need. Obviously, as I said, only 25 to 30% or so of communities have this. So we have information that about how do you develop that locally, and some practical information on non-funding or non-traditional funding approaches and project delivery. I'll talk about this in a second. We've heard a little bit about Minnesota thus far, but there's some case studies there that really focus on how do we actually do this in nuts and bolts ways, where we can use this indirect usage of offset potable usage. And that, oftentimes having things like a market-based approach or a framework like that can help to. So these aren't just isolated. These strategies work together, and we've got that explained kind of and listed out. And then community-based public-private partnerships is a kind of a watershed-based way of looking at holistically how to get investment for stormwater, as well as across different water utilities for overall benefits to the community. And they've also been used to generate and to get money from the SRF programs in a way that other approaches have not. So that's another way that we can utilize. And this is a program and approach that's been set up by EPA, and it's been used in multiple places across the country. And finally, we've had some case studies. We've talked with a number of communities, and I just want to highlight one of the more interesting ones, which is we've talked about Minnesota again. There's two communities in Minnesota that I wanted to highlight here because it's a water-rich area, especially surface water. But they found some innovative ways to drive investment, stormwater capture and use. They're similar in nature. They're not huge communities. We're talking about populations between 10 and 20,000. But they're both located, one's in northern North St. Paul, the other one, or the northern suburbs of St. Paul, the other one is the western suburbs of Minneapolis, but they're on that urbanizing ex-urban fringe area. So there's urbanization pressures that require stormwater management as development occurs, and there's retention standards there. And there's also a fair amount of, think the land has 13,000 lakes. That means there's a lot of wetlands and ponds and whatnot around. So finding locations for stormwater management facilities can be challenging, especially if you've got areas that have lots of water resources that need to remain in place, but also challenging soils. So this requires some type of innovative approach. I also note that both communities have stormwater utilities, and Minnesota has many stormwater utilities set up. So that also provides some opportunities for funding that otherwise wouldn't be the case. In both of these communities, they've set up frameworks that capture runoff from in stormwater ponds, and they use them for irrigation. And one community focuses on commercial, the other community focuses on residential at this time. But they both are similar in that they provide upfront financing for or funding for the equipment to draw runoff from these ponds and use them for irrigation. One community in Waconia, as an example, has estimated that they can reduce their water direct water potable usage by 10 million gallons annually. That means that they can stretch, obviously, these resources further. And in Minnesota, which is has so much surface water, they actually 70% of the urban area, or the water, 70% of water use in the urban areas comes from groundwater. So they're really trying to protect that because it's not sustainable the way it's being used. So this is a way to do this. So this is seen as a common sense solution for these communities. And they've come up with, one is actually set up a stormwater reuse utility itself that will be self-sustaining, they hope. There has been some support through subsidies at the state level thus far with these programs, but they feel like they can be sustainable financially. And these could be models for others in the future. So, so that there's much more to be said, but I just want to respect the time we have, and I know we have more questions. I believe that Shannon, you had some comments you want to make on communication, so I'll hand this over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Seth. And actually, as we don't have Stephen Groner with us today, I'll just highlight a couple big picture things. But actually, before I do, I know we have one of our presenters, Dave. Actually, before I go on, I kind of want to go just off script a little bit. And if you're able to pop on and maybe address something that came up around treatment, love to have your final words here, and then we'll move on to the other sections.
I shall try, Shannon. I'm sorry, folks, but I need to run to the airport in just a minute. We noted that there's a number of questions that are asking about specific kind of treatment versus kind of pollutant issues. And, you know, have you thought about this scenario? And I guess I would say, rather than try to address those individually, I will say we're trying to understand how practitioners who are trying to develop these projects are addressing those kinds of scenarios and figuring out what they need to treat to put stormwater or rainwater to specific uses that they have in mind. And I think one thing that we've noticed that makes this difficult is the absence of overarching definitive technical guidance in the stormwater management field about the availability and kind of the efficacy of different specific treatment methods to address specific pollutants to specific treatment levels. And in order to develop regulatory frameworks that clearly identify how different kinds of stormwater capture and use are to be regulated and the levels of treatment that are going to be required, you kind of need to have that analytical backbone. So this is a struggle overall in the stormwater world, as you probably know. But I think around stormwater capture and use, it's one of the key challenges that we are hearing from the communities who we have been talking to. And you know, we'll try to. We feel like a lot of progress is being made in the arena of pathogen control associated with capture and use, but there's going to be other challenges as well. And so we're trying to kind of reflect the truth of the matter in the framework report that we're writing and identify resources that are available that help, but also kind of acknowledge there's areas for continued research and development work to address the gap areas as well. So with that, I'm going to say farewell and thank you to everyone.
Thank you so much, Dave. Before we move on to Q&A, I just want to highlight a couple key points from findings that Stephen Groner has come across in his work with the various communities and partners that we've been working with. So essentially, one of the ways that he'll talk about communication is internal and externally facing. So externally facing, I'm going to highlight 2 points. Oftentimes people talk about public acceptance around wastewater, and they might, or typical water reuse, and they might compare that to stormwater, when in fact they're two distinctly different things that have two typically distinct public receptions. Wastewater is weighed down by its past and its history. not really what it's able to make possible. So it does have a kind of an image problem that it often finds hard to escape. And a lot of the communication is about moving beyond its past, looking forward to the future. The public perception around stormwater, as Stephen likes to elucidate on, is really quite different. People see it as often as a resource that why would they waste otherwise, right? This resource, as Janet really kind of expanded on, offers multiple benefits. And these multiple benefits can be actualized through stormwater use and integration into their community and help them optimize opportunities and face community challenges. So that's one external way around communications and stormwater that's really come to light. I will say a really significant piece around internal communications and stormwater is the siloing effect. Oftentimes people, agencies, utilities, they're just not that different from, other companies, organizations where different departments with different goals are siloed. So sometimes the integration around drinking water, storm water, they're very separate. And so it's really hard to bring together those two different areas. Sometimes you have different departments under one utility, and that may assist in breaking down those silos, but not always. It actually is an ongoing challenge, and that the internal communication around the opportunities that stormwater can provide for supplementing water or contributing to water supply planning are significant, and breaking down those internal silos is a key challenge that needs to be overcome. So with that, I'll just those are some key highlights from the communications piece. If Stephen were here, he could, he would expand on that much more, but we have a few minutes left for questions, and I want to make sure that both Seth and Janet have time to answer some of the questions that have come up. And actually, I'll just start off here. Let's go into questions and look at number 26. And Seth or Janet, you actually hit on this pretty directly, but this is from Jim Rasmus, is the nomenclature direct water supply augmentation and indirect water supply augmentation developed as part of this study? Talk about some of the thoughts behind this. It seems to be confusing in the context of indirect potable reuse and direct potable reuse and wastewater recycling. Is there a reason we couldn't just stick with potable and non-potable here? Do you want to start off with that, Janet?
Sure. No, that's a good comment. And actually, we went back and read our draft, and that was one of the comments we had on it. So we're using that nomenclature for now. I think you're right. It can be confusing. I think the point was really to show we're not just talking about physically taking stormwater, capturing it, and directly putting it into the water system. That's one way to do it. We're using it as that kind of source of supply, but offsetting potable water use is also, and it's not always exactly the same as potable and non-potable. So we may just need to find some better terminology there.
Yeah, I agree. I'll just say that I agree. That it's confusing, and I think there's ways to improve on that.
Yep.
Seth, we had a question come in talking about the case study that you provided and highlighting Waconia. And can you expand on the Waconia water quality treatment bank that was set up?
Yeah, so Minnesota's a little bit different, like every state's a little bit different. They have watershed districts there, and the watershed districts have a certain amount of regulatory control. But sometimes they can give more regulatory control to the locality if the locality wants to have that. So the long story, the short story on that is that the city of Waconia worked with their watershed district and said, "Hey, we want to set up this bank, and then you guys can use it as land development comes in, but they have to be the ones to recognize it. So because these are, in Waconia at least, the ponds that they're using for banking are primarily, and they started out in public right away. So that was an easy way for them to get this going. And then they set them up for commercial areas to bring in commercial development. So it's just as straightforward as the city built these facilities. And I think, Janet, you could probably talk about what's gone on in Grand Rapids. I think it's similar to what's gone on there, where there's a public investment to build up these ponds, and then commercial development that occurs, for instance, Waconia, instead of them developing their own stormwater management, they just pay a fee into to the city for usage of the already developed and constructed stormwater pond. And they have a calculator they have actually developed, which is really clever, that shows here's what it would cost for you to do this, traditionally just kind of planning level cost. And here's what it'll cost for us with the user fees and whatnot. And you can see pretty quickly and easily that it pencils out in a lot of instances. So that's how that's the level of detail that it's easy enough to cover at this point. But I don't know if that answers that. Janet, any thoughts about that in the context of Grand Rapids? I think this could potentially be something that might be able to be applicable in that context, or maybe not. I'm not sure.
A little bit, yeah. It's more of a market that involves. It's very similar, but it in that it allows people, instead of implementing stormwater infrastructure on site, they can purchase it from elsewhere. But in Grand Rapids, it can also include facilities built not just by the public agency, but by other private project developers. And they have to kind of meet the same standards and provide additional stormwater capacity in order to let the people purchase that kind of compliance. It's more strictly for the purposes of stormwater management rather than water supply, but has kind of a similar context.
Yeah, and I'll just mention real quickly in Waconia, because of the scale and the circumstances behind that, I think that it's feasible for this to be financed and funded in a sustainable way. I believe it may not be the case everywhere all the time, but I think there's a lot of places where this could work. But the point is that they worked with the regulators to make it happen, and so it can be done.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask our final question here, and it's about avoided costs. So we can all kind of chime in here, noting that we just have just under a couple minutes here, but avoided costs related to infrastructure protection can be difficult to sell. So do we want to speak to that? And real quickly, I'm going to channel Stephen and say he has mentioned before that oftentimes people respond to the pain points or pinch points of circumstances rather than to the opportunities that might be presented. So I'll put that out there. But how can we talk about the benefits of stormwater as it can contribute to water supply planning as it relates to avoided costs and avoided disruptions?
Well, that's an economic concept, so I'll let you continue on that, Janet.
It's something that we talk about a lot. I'm not sure from the perspective of this commenter, but it is something we talk about a lot in terms of, in this particular instance, we're thinking about what will happen in the future if this project is implemented. So understanding your kind of baseline and looking to whether it's water supply plans or really the true cost of what the cost of water will be in the future as compared to whether or not we do this project, how stormwater can offset those costs. I think the extent to which it relies on actual, plans or you can demonstrate that is really the baseline. I think it can make it a little easier to sell. The cost of disruptions can be difficult because it is hard to put your kind of head around those. What's the cost of a water supply disruption? And that really is only going to happen in the case of, in an area that is facing water shortages. So that also kind of has to be documented before kind of pointing to those benefits.
I know, Lindsay, we're short on time, so.
Yeah, I was going to.
If you have just a quick thought, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm good. I think Janet
Okay.
addressed that perfectly.
Okay. Thank you all. Shannon, do you have any last parting words?
No, I'll just say we're really excited to share the outcomes and the tools that are developed as part of this project with the broader public. And when we get to that point, we look forward to sharing them with you, and feedback along the way. If you wish to be engaged, please let us know. And I'll hand it back to you. Janet or Seth, is there anything you would like to say about this project?
No, it's exciting, and we've learned a lot, and I think we're going to be learning some more. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, well, thank you all. Thank you so much to our audience for your participation. We had so many questions today. We did not get to all of them, but your questions will be addressed. We have your contact information, so we will get back to you. And a reminder, you can check out this webcast again on our website on demand. You can download it, check out the slides. And as Shannon said, please engage with us. You can reach out to me, to her. The project will continue on, and you can keep up to date with deliverables on the project website. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thanks.